you get the bright idea, jump overboard and swim ashore.
We're there about 12, and you're at Montauk, Long Island, Broad, and the
Phoenix Project.
fields on the New Mountain Sea.
By this point, you'd be hard-pressed to meet someone who hasn't seen Stranger Things. As a matter of fact, the latest season, Season 4, broke Netflix's previous record of most time streamed by an English-language show in its first week with a staggering figure, 335 million hours streamed by viewers from May 30th to June 5th. To say then that the show is simply popular is an incredible understatement. With its mix of dazzling special effects, good cast chemistry and performances, and a storyline chock full of homages to 80s horror and sci-fi classics, it's easy to understand how it earned the spot as one of Netflix's top shows. It's a retro nostalgia security blanket for anyone born in the 80s and 90s, and a reinvention of the hits for the youth. But what if I told you that Hawkins, the fictional town where Stranger Things is set, might not be fiction at all? What if everything was true? Join me on today's episode as we infiltrate the military base in Montauk, New York, as we discuss the Montauk Project. But, and this is a big, juicy but, before we do, I need to ask you to perform emergency surgery on the subscribe button by aggressively clicking it back to life with CPR, followed by gentle compressions of the like button. Now, back to the Montauk Project. In the evening hours of August 12, 1983, Edward Cameron, later known as Al Bielek, and his brother Duncan ripped through a hole in the very fabric of space and time from the year 1943 while participating as part of an experiment aboard the USS Eldridge during World War II in what is now known as the now infamous Philadelphia Experiment. If that all sounds familiar to you, it should, as I have covered Al's amazing story in a prior episode. I highly encourage you to click the link in this video to hear more about his account. That describes, in detail, a failed US Navy experiment to render an entire warship, in this case, the USS Eldridge, invisible by encasing it in what is now known as an electromagnetic bubble. But instead, it teleported the ship and crew with catastrophic consequences. During the test, the brothers, who were in the control room as it became incredibly unstable and quickly grew wildly out of control, forcing them to seek an escape. They yelled for help over the radio, but when communications went out, they flung the door to the control room open and ran for their lives. Panicked, they fled what could have become their tomb below deck, and went topside to the main deck of the Eldridge, reeling in utter horror at the sight of the ship. The crew were mostly dead or dying, some fused to the ship itself. Those that hadn't died or been gravely injured had seemingly gone mad from the effects of whatever had just occurred to them. The brothers had been protected from much of the harmful effects of the experiment while below deck, in the experiment's control room, and, after surveying the carnage on the main deck, decided to jump over the ship's railing into the strange aura that surrounded the ship, into the cosmic unknown. As reported in my previous video, the brothers Cameron were eventually sent back to the decks of the Eldridge to stop the experiment in 1943, from which they had escaped by any means necessary, on orders from their boss from that time, 1943, Dr. John von Neumann, now a much older man, in 1983, where they had ended up after entering that mysterious time fog that surrounded the Eldridge, and who was now a lead at the Montauk military base, tasked with carrying out various experiments. While they did stop the Philadelphia experiment by destroying the ship's equipment after being sent back from the future, Duncan decided to leap back into the time fog in 1943 that surrounded the vessel, leaving a stunned Al still aboard the ship as it phased back into the 1940s. What then happened to Duncan? Where did he go? This is his story as much as any of the others. The story of Duncan Cameron and the Montauk Project, and how he may be the inspiration for one of the most popular characters on television today. Crashing back into 1983 after entering the time fog, Duncan was in really bad shape. The effects of time travel had done a number on his body, and he began to age rapidly, a man untethered from time, ultimately close to death. He had quite possibly saved the Earth, but at a heavy cost. Dr. von Neumann and the others at Montauk, knowing he was extremely valuable, didn't want to let him simply die. That could have disastrous consequences for not only Duncan, as he barely clung to life, but for the timeline itself, and could potentially create bizarre time paradoxes, smashing the fabric of reality into a million fragmented pieces. Von Neumann hatched a plan, and using the same time displacement equipment used to send the brothers back to 1943, got a message to the year 1947 and convinced Cameron's father to allow them to transfer Duncan's consciousness to another son, who was, as of yet to be born. But to transfer an entire consciousness to another person, they would have to follow the Earth's complex biorhythms, and would not be able to do so for almost another 2 decades. Thus, in 1963, Duncan was reborn after Montauk was able to transfer his consciousness from the year 1983 using their technology on the base. Are you following all of this so far? To tell the next part of our story, which ties a little more neatly into Stranger Things, we need to introduce Preston Nichols. Preston Nichols was an electrical engineer with a specialization in electromagnetic phenomena, working for a defense contractor named BJM, who became keenly interested in psychic research when, in the early 1970s, he discovered that telepathic communication acted in a very similar fashion to radio waves. Nichols already knew how radio waves worked, but telepathic communication? Had this ever been looked into before? I mean, really looked into? I mean, if Preston was an arrow, he now found his target. Let's fast forward a little bit to the 1980s. Preston, at this point, had begun working with self-described psychics in an attempt to figure out how it all worked, when he noticed something peculiar. They all seemed to have some sort of stoppage of cohesive thought at or about the same time each day. When he was able to trace the source of whatever was seemingly halting their ability to think, it led him to the Montauk Air Force Base, which sat silently nearby, with its large, semi-automatic ground environment system, or SAGE radar tower, looming ominously over the town of Montauk. Something was going on at the base, which was supposedly closed, but in his obsession, he had to know the truth. Eventually, he was able to gain access to the base. Nichols and a friend named Brian, who himself had strong psychic abilities, were exploring the derelict base when they discovered a homeless man who appeared to be living on the property and claimed to be a former employee of the base. He confirmed that staff had been conducting illegal tests and experiments there, described some of the equipment they had been using, and said a terrible creature had been let loose by some force a year or so before, causing the military to close the base. Perhaps the strangest of all, though, was the man's statement that Nichols had been his boss on the project. Brian, using his psychic abilities, was able to confirm that the man was telling the truth. But why couldn't Nichols remember this at all? A short time later, after they had finished snooping around the base, a man appeared at Preston's lab to see if he could help him repair a piece of audio equipment. The man, you might ask? None other than Duncan Cameron. After some talk, Duncan seemed interested in learning more about Nichols' side project, psychic research. Preston, sensing that Duncan had some sort of psychic ability, decided to show him the Montauk base to see if it sparked something in the young psychic. Upon arrival, Duncan seemed to immediately recognize the place, although he had claimed to have never been there before. He was even able to show Nichols things like where the bulletin board was in the mess hall, and key details like certain areas of the facility and what they had been used for. When they went into the transmitter building of the radar tower, though, Duncan seemed to go into a trance. He began spouting out information at a rapid rate. Preston, rushed over and had to physically shake him out of it. And once he did, Duncan, who had by then shed layers of mental programming, revealed to him that he had actually been sent to kill Nichols and blow up his lab. It would seem Nichols had irritated whoever was funding this black op, and they wanted him out of the picture for good. However, with Duncan now out of his brainwashed daze and having most of his memories back, he and Preston set out to discover what had really happened at Montauk. Accounts vary, but over time, Preston and Duncan both had seemingly recovered most, if not all, of their repressed memories of what had happened at Montauk, along with others involved, like Al Bielek. According to them, the base was used for, among other things, mind control and remote viewing, or the ability to see what someone is doing or thinking using nothing but your mind from a distance. Time travel and time tunnels, or opening a literal tunnel in space-time and being able to view whatever is on the other side. Like in a modern video game like BioShock Infinite. They were also allegedly able to time warp or bend space-time to allow for parallel versions of a person to exist on the same timeline. With that revelation, Nichols was able to explain how he could seemingly be working at one job at BJM while simultaneously working at Montauk. Lastly, Duncan was said to be able to conjure objects from the ether of creation itself using nothing but his mind. He could literally think of something while in a deep state and bring it to life. But how the heck were they able to do all of this? According to Nichols, they had constructed something called the Montauk chair, which was a device that a subject sat in while in an altered state that amplified their psychic abilities to almost superhuman levels, sometimes at the cost of the user's sanity. The alternate timeline version of Nichols was present for many of these experiments, which often used kidnapped children as test subjects for these truly harsh and brutal sessions, where they were being used to develop some sort of psychic soldier program. According to Nichols, however, on August 12, 1983, he and a few colleagues, including that timeline's Al Bielek and a small group of scientists assigned to work on the project with him, had had enough and came up with a plan to put an end to all these experiments, which left unchecked could destroy reality itself if they were to go out of control. Between the Philadelphia experiment, the kidnappings, the chair, the psychic warfare program, it was time to put an end to this evil once and for all. As Duncan opened a time portal while in a psychic state, Al Bielek and Duncan Cameron from 1943 were seen from the other side. But the researchers were careful to keep the current timeline versions of the brothers from seeing the past versions of themselves, or risk creating a time paradox. Nichols seized this opportunity of distraction to whisper something to the 1983 version of Duncan, a prompt of, "The time is now," to activate him while he was in the chair. And in his deep trance-like state, a horrible creature was summoned from deep in Duncan's subconscious mind. It began ripping through the base, destroying anything in its path. The scientists and soldiers desperately tried to cut the power and stop this monster from killing everyone on the base. And the only way to do so was to shut down all of the equipment amplifying Duncan's thoughts. It wasn't until Nichols cut his way through the conduits and cabinets to the transmitter of the chair, and the alternate timeline versions of Bielek and Cameron destroyed the equipment on the Eldridge, back in the past as they were all in sync, that the monster faded away into the nothingness from which it had emerged, back into the ether of Duncan's mind. The two events, linked by the brothers on two different timelines, had finally been stopped, and the loop was closed forever. The military abruptly halted the project after the events of August 83. The test subjects were brainwashed. Special operations teams made sure the site was scrubbed and everything of importance was removed. The lower levels of the facility were filled in with concrete. Staff were reassigned, and everything, as it so often is when a covert op is involved, was covered up. This is only the tip of the iceberg with this story, but for more on Montauk, I'll have to talk about that another time. You can clearly see where the Duffer Brothers, the creators of Stranger Things, got some inspiration from this case for the show. Montauk, New York sounds an awful lot like Hawkins, Indiana. A quaint small town on the outside, but sinister forces lurk on the inside, operating from the shadows. Monsters from beyond our plane of existence cross over from one reality into our own to cause chaos and carnage. Warping and parallel reality travel become possible thanks to technology we can't truly control or understand. The Hawkins Lab is run by officials who reportedly work for the US Department of Energy in Stranger Things. In Montauk, the very real Brookhaven National Lab was allegedly behind it all. Rogue scientists, masquerading as officials of the US Department of Energy, operating with little to no oversight, conducting psychic experiments, sounds an awful lot like Eleven's backstory, with Duncan perhaps being the inspiration for her character. The setup of scientists working to create child psychic warriors in a small town is almost identical, as a matter of fact, with some liberties thrown in for Hollywood flair. It's a great tale, whether it be fact or fiction, and in the world of science, it's only a very small step to either side to make it one way versus another. One decade's science fiction becomes the next decade's science fact. I like to think, though, that if it is indeed fact, we at least got a happy ending for the Cameron brothers. After all this, and I haven't even covered half of it, Ed, or as he's known now, Al Bielek, and Duncan were free. After surviving everything, heck, even being reincarnated, they were out to finally live their lives and tell us their incredible story. Without even realizing it, millions of people around the world know at least a little piece of what they disclose to the world in the form of a little show called Stranger Things. And their memories will now live on forever. And I, for one, think that's pretty nice. Till next time, everyone, I've been your host, Tinfoil Tom, saying, I'm ready to believe you.
These films of her demonstrating PK.
Smuggled out of the country by American researchers.
In our last episode, we established the connection between Stranger Things and an alleged secret US government experiment known as the Montauk Project. Heck, even the original pilot title for Stranger Things was called Montauk, so clearly, it influenced the show. For those who haven't watched my previous investigation, I urge you to do so by clicking the link provided in this video. Essentially, it detailed a top-secret government program to use subjects, usually kidnapped children, and transform them into psychic soldiers during the 1970s and 80s, until it was stopped when a monster tore through the base. 11, and some of the events and lore of the show were initially at least partially inspired by a young psychic named Duncan Cameron, who was used in those experiments described by Preston Nichols in his book, Experiments in Time. Duncan and Preston would go on to speak out publicly and tell us this terrifying tale, and I encourage you to watch my video on Montauk for the full story. For this episode, however, I'll be discussing another influence on Stranger Things, and her impact on one of the show's main characters, 11. Tonight, we're going behind the Iron Curtain. Tonight, we're telling the story of Nina Kulagina and how she may have been part of the Russian equivalent to the US Psychic Soldier program. But, and this is a big, bodacious but, before we do, I must ask that you move the like button with your mind, followed by psychically clicking the subscribe button for future content. Now, back to Nina Kulagina. By now, I think most of us who are interested have seen the latest season, Season 4, of Stranger Things. In it, and a mild spoiler warning here, Eleven is brought to a top-secret facility in the Nevada desert run by Dr. Brenner and Dr. Owens to rejuvenate her powers she had lost through her battles in Season 3. The name of both the episode and the project in the show is the Nina Project. A clear and obvious nod to someone who was very real in history, Nina Kulajinya. But who was Nina? And how did she inspire Stranger Things? Let's grab our shovels and start digging for some answers. Nina Kulajinya was born on July 30th, 1926 in St. Petersburg, Russia. During World War II, while only a teenager, she acted as a radio operator for a tank battalion until she was severely wounded in battle, placing her out of active duty for the rest of the war. After the conclusion of World War II, she seemed to live a fairly normal life. She married and had children, but like so many people of the time, the shadows of the war haunted her. Like so many others, she had lost friends, family, and nearly died herself in the conflict. And that takes a toll. These shadows, like they so often do, caught up to her, and she seemed to suffer some sort of breakdown in the early 1960s. Remember, this was a time before PTSD was fully recognized, so many soldiers were just expected to suffer in silence. After years of untreated post-war trauma, Nina's mind and body had finally had enough, and she was admitted to the hospital to rest and recuperate to help repair her mind. While there, however, something rather strange happened. While listening to a radio broadcast, she heard the story of another Russian woman who could seemingly see colors of objects by touching them while her eyes were closed. To her husband's astonishment, Nina demonstrated she could not only do this, while also blindfolded, she could also read from objects, like texts and coins, using nothing but her mind, while her husband was in a completely separate room. Nina also described objects moving in response to her moods, particularly when she was angry, ever since she was young, but could never quite put her finger on why, until now. Let's just call this a revelation. She had discovered she had a gift, and it all just fit together, and it was only going to get stranger from here. So, some context here. The United States and Soviet Union were in the midst of the Cold War at this point, the 1960s and 70s, and programs like MKUltra, the CIA's covert operation involving illegal mind control experimentation, among other things, were well underway in the US. The Soviet Union, in response, authorized the study and implementation of practices that would have otherwise been frowned upon under Soviet laws and government at the time. The study and use of methods that could be considered occult by altering the wording in such a way as to make it sound technical or scientific. According to historian Annie Jacobson, an example of this would be something like psychokinesis, or moving physical objects with one's mind, would then become the study of, quote, non-ionizing, in particular electromagnetic emissions from humans, end quote. So essentially, the Soviet Union were seeking to remove elements of mysticism or spiritualism from these demonstrations of abilities by making them purely scientific and controlled under laboratory settings, and if successful, would give them a very clear and distinct advantage over the US during the Cold War, who were engaging in similar studies throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. As seen in Stranger Things, the Soviet Union is often seen engaging in parallel experiments to the US by trying to open portals to the Upside Down, with predictably disastrous results. 11 is even thought to be Russian at first by Murray Bowman, a key American character of the show, and he thinks that she is the result of some Soviet experiment gone awry, sent to Hawkins, Indiana, to rain destruction upon the town. So, just how close was the depiction of Nina to 11? Well, it turns out the truth is a lot less intense than the fiction. In reality, Nina Kulajinya was shown to have abilities that could be similar to 11's, albeit not nearly as powerful or dangerous. It would take her some time to muster up the energy through meditation to move even small objects with her mind, like matchsticks or watch dials. Even these objects, tiny in comparison to, say, 11 throwing a person across a room or stopping a car with her powers, would cause tremendous strain to Nina by the end of the session. She would often complain of intense headaches after performing such feats and be completely exhausted after tests. Scientists measuring her heart rate would report it would spike during the tests. Clearly, the force her body was exerting was at a great physical and mental cost. But the tests would continue. In 1973, she demonstrated her abilities to British researcher Benson Herbert, who witnessed her moving a hydrometer and a saline solution from several feet away. He described her as being quite ill at this time period, though, possibly as a result of all the experimentation. And after managing to rotate the needle of a compass using her mind, she collapsed into her chair. Strangely, however, the compass itself began moving about the table as she sat, motionless in the chair. Could this have been as a result of her exerting too much PK energy? The British researcher, along with his colleagues, had been quite diligent in checking for any sort of trickery like wires, and believed her to be legitimate. The most famous experiment that was captured on film involved her keeping a frog's heart beating after it had been removed and placed in a solution nearby to allow for this transfer of energy. She did so and was able to make it beat faster, then slower, and eventually even stop the beating heart. A researcher in the room then asked for her to make his heart quicken, and when she was able to elevate his heart rate dramatically using nothing but her mind, the experiment was quickly ended. She had nearly caused a fatal heart attack in the researcher. At least partially as a response to footage of Nina smuggled out of the Soviet Union, and her reputation in both the East and West as someone who reasonably demonstrated they had PK, or psychokinesis ability, the US launched its own measures to counter the, quote, Soviet psychoenergetic threat, and programs like Stargate, a US operation to develop psychic soldiers, were born. Things like the Montauk Project then, if not real, were almost certainly based on these projects, which did exist. Officially, until at least 1995, when the CIA allegedly shut down the projects, at least on the United States end. Nina Kulagina was studied by the Soviets for nearly 20 years, under controlled laboratory settings by top scientists. But who knows how many others were involved on their side of this research. Nina was the subject of much study and debate in the Soviet Union during her life. Definitely at least the face for this type of research, eventually causing a prominent Soviet newspaper to describe her as a fraud. She took the paper to court, and thanks to the testimony of prominent scientists like Dr. Yuri Kobyzarev, one of the fathers of Soviet radio engineering and physics, and Dr. Yuri Golyayev, a top Soviet physicist, both of whom were present during much of the time she was being studied, she won her court case in 1988, and the paper had to print a retraction. It would seem she was the real deal. Nina Kulagina died just a short time later, in 1990, possibly as a result of the strain of years of research into her abilities. The strangest thing about her death, however, is the connection to the character of Eleven herself. Nina died on the 11th of April, 1990, of a heart attack. 11 clearly being some sort of tribute to Nina herself, with the date of her death being the literal name for the character. Is this some sort of foreshadowing for what will become of Eleven's character in Stranger Things? Pushed to the limits of what the human body can endure, eventually contributing to an untimely end? It looks like we won't find out until the season 5 finale of the show, reportedly sometime in 2024. Nina at least partially contributed to the lore of Stranger Things, and helped shape the story for Eleven, and for that, her memory will endure for years to come. Until next time, I've been your host Tinfoil Tom saying, I'm ready to believe you.
I think that the music in hell for eternity be some of this rock music.
Police are very reluctant to investigate these crimes as satanic crimes, Barbara, because communities quite naturally don't want their reputation stigmatized as being the home of the devil.
Dungeons and Dragons is a real serious problem.
We'll take a break. When kids kill kids, did the devil make them do it?
Studies have linked violent behavior to the game, satanic worship, ritual sacrifice, and even
In the 1980s, a widespread and irrational panic began to spread across America, and soon enough, it was covered by major news outlets across the world. The words "satanic panic" echoed throughout homes during the evening news, and this unsubstantiated outrage was only made worse by the headlines seen on tabloid magazine covers at supermarket checkout stands. It was everywhere in the 80s and 90s. The reports told stories of devil-worshipping cults performing occult rituals in secret ceremonies all across the United States, and news anchors instructed viewers to look out for those wearing all black, listening to heavy metal music, and to be especially wary of those playing games like Dungeons and Dragons, as it was a lure to the dark side, and were sure signs they might be Satan worshippers. Basically, it was a whole bunch of stinky rubbish. To make matters even worse, police departments reinforced this narrative, going so far as to distribute training tapes on what to look out for to members of law enforcement. This phenomenon and its impact on society has endured to this day in many minds, and has influenced current shows like Stranger Things, specifically in the depiction of a newer main character on the show, Eddie Munson. Eddie has long hair, listens to bands like Metallica, and plays Dungeons and Dragons with his gaming group, the Hellfire Club, made up of members of Hawkins High School, including core Stranger Things cast members Lucas, Dustin, Mike, and Erica. After some mysterious deaths start to plague Hawkins, Eddie is made the scapegoat for the crimes by the locals. Why? Because he's different. The small-town conservative mindset of Hawkins rallies against him solely because he is different. The townsfolk are swept up in the 1980s satanic panic. Anyone who grew up in a smaller rural town understands this. That sort of narrow thinking is especially prominent in areas like that, where if the wind blows in a different direction, townsfolk run for cover. But what if I told you Eddie was based on a real story, a real person? Tonight, we're discussing the real Eddie Munson. Tonight, we're talking about the case of Damien Eccles and the West Memphis Three, and the Robin Hood Hills murders. In the early evening hours of May 5th, 1993, 8-year-olds Stevie Branch, Christopher Byers, and Michael Moore were playing in their neighborhood in West Memphis, Arkansas. Multiple eyewitnesses reported seeing Terry Hobbs, Stevie Branch's stepfather, instructing the boys to be home around 6:30 p.m. This would be the last time all three boys would be seen alive. By around 8 p.m., when Christopher Byers had still not returned home, his father, John Mark Byers, called the West Memphis Police Department, who began investigating the area, looking for the kids. A short time later, a distraught Byers began frantically searching a wooded area nearby where the boys often played, known as Robin Hood Hills. This area was a densely wooded place near the boys' homes where kids often played, much to the dismay of their parents. It is important to note that this area is also adjacent to one of the busiest highways in America and a truck stop, making it a deceptively dangerous area for kids to be left unattended. Literally hundreds, if not thousands of people stopped nearby each day from all areas of the country. As the light began to fade away and give rise to the darkness of the cold West Memphis night, the police would decide to wait until morning to conduct a full search for the missing children. Visibility in the densely wooded area was low, and it became dangerous to explore the area under those conditions at night. Despite an exhaustive search once the sun came up, led by investigator Gary Gitchell, which began early that next morning, no sign of the boys could be found. Sometime around 1:30 p.m. though, while searching Robin Hood Hills, juvenile patrol officer Steve Jones saw something floating in the water. It later turned out to be a shoe. As he peered down the steep banks of a water-filled ditch in the woods of Robin Hood Hills, he could sense something was wrong here, and he called for backup. He radioed for help, and Detective Mike Allen soon arrived to investigate. While attempting to grab the shoe, Allen fell into the water and began searching on his hands and knees. And in doing so, he ended up dislodging something that had been concealed under the water: the sunken, carefully concealed body of Michael Moore. Soon after, the two other missing children, Stevie Branch and Christopher Byers, were discovered. All three had been murdered in Robin Hood Hills. West Memphis had a killer on the loose, and it wouldn't be long before police had arrested someone for the crimes. These crimes are particularly grisly and awful, so I won't go into much detail here, but if you do go searching, just a fair warning, this was truly a heinous crime, and understandably elicited a huge emotional response from the public, both locally and nationally, due to the monstrosity and inhumanity of the crime. Damien Echols, who was 18 at the time of his arrest for the murders, was already on the radar of local law enforcement, but mostly for being a nonconformist in a mostly conservative, religious, small community. He had had his share of troubles with the law, for sure. Trouble that eventually landed him in a juvenile facility. But was it really enough to make him a murderer? Damien, along with his friend Jason Baldwin, were known for some petty, minor offenses. Things like vandalism and shoplifting. But I would argue that a lot of teenagers would fall into some degree of criminality for those same offenses. His most serious crime up to that point was being arrested a year or so prior to the murders for breaking into an abandoned trailer in the nearby Lakeshore Estates with his then-girlfriend, Deanna Holcomb. The two had plans to run away together, to escape the mundane misery that was their small, conservative, religious hometown for a bigger city like Memphis. But eventually, Damien ended up in a juvenile detention facility after the break-in resulted in an arrest. But was behavior like this enough to warrant being a suspect in a triple murder? Almost certainly not. But it did put him on the radar of local law enforcement. Specifically, a 53-year-old former cargo pilot turned local juvenile enforcement and probation officer named Jerry Driver, who was absolutely convinced that the forces of Satan ran rampant in Arkansas, and it was his job to stop it. He was fully swept up in the mania of the Satanic Panic, and it had made him paranoid and fearful of kids like Damien, whom he believed to be a practitioner of occult devil worship after some run-ins with the teenager in his role as a juvenile officer. An example of Driver's absolute obsession with the notion of devil cults run amok comes from the book Blood of Innocence and a local paper, The Commercial Appeal, where Driver is described as literally driving around on full moons with his partner Steve Jones to find and stop Satanists and cults conducting rituals in the woods, and in spots like aqueducts, in the light of the full moon in 1992, but especially that entire summer. He's quoted in Blood of Innocence as saying,
Well, we went everywhere in the world that summer. Every time there was a witch's Sabbath, we were out in force. And whether that did any good or not, I don't know. But to my knowledge, nothing happened that summer.
Jerry Driver was an actual law enforcement official in West Memphis. In this obsession, Driver would continue pounding the drum of guilt towards Damien's direction throughout the entire investigation, convinced he was the leader of a satanic cult, eventually making Damien the prime suspect in the eyes of police, who were desperate for someone to pin these crimes on. This fit the narrative of a cult performing some sort of sacrifice in their small town. This was the only way they could seem to rationalize this crime. Damien, to his credit, fully admits he was a troubled kid at this time, no doubt, being diagnosed with depression, among other things. But imagine what most of us are like as teenagers, especially those of us who are considered outcasts. His most visible crimes, in this investigator's opinion, mostly consisted of listening to heavy metal, wearing all black, and essentially just kind of being a goth kid who could be obnoxious towards adults. He was a spooky kid who scared the conservative religious folks around him, and in a town like West Memphis, Arkansas, that was enough to hang you in the court of public opinion, or at the very least, make you a suspect. Jason Baldwin's crime was merely being close friends with Damien Echols, and similarly, as someone who didn't fit the mold of their small town. Like Damien, he had long hair, listened to bands like Metallica, and liked to draw, for which he was rather talented. But artists weren't exactly the most respected bunch in West Memphis, Arkansas. Simply by being friends with Damien and a little bit different, he also fell under suspicion of law enforcement after they began to focus their efforts on Damien Echols, since they now believed, thanks to folks like Jerry Driver, that Damien led a satanic cult in West Memphis. And unfortunately for Jason, a satanic cult needed cult members, and Jason was lumped into this mess. He was only 16 at the time of his arrest. And finally, we had 17-year-old Jesse Miskelly, an acquaintance of both Echols and Baldwin's from school. He was known as being quick to anger and having a reputation as a fighter. This short temper often put him at odds with local authorities, which also put Jesse under the eye of the investigators. Jesse, although capable enough in his daily life, also had a reported IQ of about 72, or in other words, Jesse had an intellectual disability. As we are about to see, this would become central in the West Memphis Police Department's case, as they would manipulate Jesse into giving what I believe to be a coerced or false confession, based on the evidence I have seen. This confession would become critical to the prosecution's case against all three teens and was the cornerstone for the state's entire case against them. Essentially, everything else against the teenagers was either circumstantial or a matter of opinion rather than fact. Shows like Geraldo and 2020 painted all three teens as devil-worshipping Satanists, both during and after the trials, and in the court of public opinion, sensationalized this for nothing more than primetime ratings at the expense of any semblance of fair trials. The teens, under arrest thanks to Jesse's confession, were dubbed the West Memphis Three. But how strong was Jesse's confession? The investigation into Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly is a remarkably flawed one, and seems to be, as I mentioned, centered around the confession of Jesse Miskelly. In the near 12-hour interrogation session against Miskelly, investigators pushed and pushed until they were finally able to break Jesse down, only putting to tape the conversations with him near the end of each session. We then do not know what was said or techniques used to manipulate a teenager with an IQ of 72. We do know a polygraph examination was administered by Bill Durham, a detective on the West Memphis police force, with him saying Jesse was, quote, lying his ass off when Jesse denied involvement with the murders. I will note here, through a later examination on the polygraph results conducted by Warren Holmes, a polygraph expert who has worked with both the FBI and CIA and worked on hundreds, if not thousands of murder cases, concluded that Detective Durham did not correctly interpret the results of the polygraph exam, stating under oath that his opinions of the test results were,
well, they were different from the other examiner. He indicated he thought there was deception in the points on the graphs where the pertinent test questions were asked. I evaluated the charts and I have come up with just the contrary opinion. I didn't feel that at the point where the pertinent test questions were asked that the defendant was deceptive in nature.
During the interrogation, police detectives Gary Gitchell and Brian Ridge continually led Jesse by the hand after Jesse broke, asking him leading questions like, quote,
all right, you told me earlier it was around 7 or 8. What time was it?
When Jesse had initially told them the crime took place at 9 a.m., then around noon, then the afternoon, and finally 7 or 8 p.m., continually pushing the murders back to a time more fitting the police theories. Jesse had even told them that the young boys had skipped school to accommodate Jesse's earlier statement that would put them on the scene, which they had not, as school records and witness statements show. And even with Jesse's disability, I am certain he could tell the difference between morning and night. The narrative was molded by investigators to better fit the crime. Another important point altered was that Jesse told the investigators they had used rope to tie up the victims, which was not true. The perpetrators of the crime had used shoelaces. Finally, Jesse could not even correctly identify the actual cause of death for the victims, going so far as to incorrectly recount events leading up to their deaths and cause. If he was present, pieces of information he certainly would have known. Detectives led Jesse down a path that would provide them with the answers needed to fit their narrative. If you have time, listen to Jesse's entire confession as it goes all over the place, takes place over multiple recordings, and it is quite obvious to see Detective Gitchell and Ridge leading him down certain paths and manipulating him. Keep in mind as well, he was there in police custody for nearly 12 hours in total, and only a fraction of that was recorded. We have no record of what was discussed off tape. Within hours of this confession, Jesse would recant all of his statements, which were given under extremely hostile conditions and without an attorney present. This confession would damn not only Jesse Miskelly, but also Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin, who were implicated as part of the fictional, ghoulish satanic cult narrative constructed by the West Memphis Police Department. Richard Offshee, a professor of sociology at the University of California who was brought in by the defense during the trial, called Jesse's confession a
classic example of police coercion.
And going even further to call Jesse's admission of guilt the
stupidest fucking confession I've ever seen.
It is my belief that the prosecution and police department then pushed for Jesse's trial to be set before Damien and Jason's, as a deliberate tactic to influence the jury pool pre-trial. If Jesse was set to go first in court, this confession, carefully constructed, would be public knowledge before the two other teens could be tried. A prime example of this jury tampering is that of the jury foreman on Eccles and Baldwin's trial, Kent Arnold. He went so far as to attempt to rally his fellow jurors during the trial to vote guilty, saying his mind was made up long before, and the teen should be convicted of the crime, without hearing any more from either side. All of this based on what I believe to be a false confession. Around the same time the boys went missing, but before a murder was known, Vicki Hutchinson was stealing from her employer elsewhere in West Memphis. She was then at the West Memphis Police Department the following day, being questioned about the theft, with her son Aaron in tow, who was friends with the then missing children, when police were notified that the bodies of the missing children had been discovered in Robin Hood Hills. Aaron then stated he had witnessed the murders to officers and delivered what were wildly inconsistent stories about devil worship and satanic cults to the officers. Aaron, now an adult, has said he doesn't know whether or not what he said was true or just a youthful imagination, along with suggestive leading for details by police officers to craft the narrative they wanted. It all seems like a story to him now, and being so young at the time, he can hardly remember the details. In 2004, he would tell the Arkansas Times, quote, "They messed with my words a lot." Reports vary after this, but most seem to agree that on the condition that no charges were filed against her, and with a possible reward given, Vicki was given permission by Officer Donald Bray to, quote, "go undercover and see if she could help unravel what the West Memphis Police Department were convinced was a satanic devil cult operating in their tiny village." About a week later, once police had narrowed the crosshairs on Damian Eccles, Vicki, who was neighbors with Jesse Miskelly, under the instruction of Officer Bray, did meet Eccles through Miskelly, but nothing came of it. She would later tell officers that Eccles and Miskelly took her to an SBAT, or witches' meeting in the woods, and that all the cult ceremonies were in fact true. This would confirm the police department's theory about a satanic cult operating right under their noses the entire time. But it was a total fabrication, a complete lie. Hutchison would later recant her testimony, saying that Jerry Driver and Officer Bray constructed the entire story, with her saying, quote,
"It was like this. I was either going to say exactly what they needed, or else."
She would go on to say that Officer Bray would tell her, "We're going to make this easy on you, Victoria, and you're just going to say exactly what we need, or things can get rough on you. You could be implicated in this murder. You could lose your son." The state's entire case was based on a false confession of a disabled teenager, corroborated by a lying witness and strictly circumstantial evidence. No DNA, no legitimate eyewitnesses to place the teens at the scene of the crime. A parade of quote-unquote experts on the occult were brought in to seal the teens' fate, and the jurors, caught up in the sensationalized satanic panic, rendered verdicts. All three were found guilty of murder, with Damien, the alleged cult mastermind, sentenced to death. And there they would languish in prison for years. Until...
And we've got evidence that even in the last 2-3 years that we believe will exonerate these kids, and we're just asking, we're doing this kind of thing now just to bring notoriety back to the case and really impress upon the Arkansas State Supreme Court that we get a fair trial and a good, careful look at this case that has been so carefully prepared.
Largely in part to a 1996 documentary series called Paradise Lost, which followed the case, worldwide attention was brought to the West Memphis Three. Rock stars and celebrities like Metallica, Henry Rollins, Peter Jackson, the Dixie Chicks, and of course, Eddie Vedder from Pearl Jam lended support, and financial backing so that things like proper DNA testing could be provided to the teens who remained incarcerated into adulthood and provide them what I believe to be a fair trial with adequate defense. It is incredibly important to remember the trio were from extraordinarily impoverished backgrounds, and even through the best efforts of the defenders assigned to them in their first trials, they simply lacked the basic resources to go against an entire system that was determined to railroad them into convictions. The police department and prosecutors were so determined to get a conviction, it simply didn't matter to them who got hurt in the process. Based on the tireless efforts of so many over the years, a deal was eventually struck between the state and the 3 men who were still locked away in prison. And so it was that in 2011, after 18 years in jail and after appeal after appeal, the West Memphis Three, now in their mid-30s, accepted what is known as an Alford plea, an extremely rare plea that essentially means the defendants plead guilty to an offense while maintaining their innocence, and were released from prison after spending half their lives behind bars. The state finally conceding something, but refusing to admit they may have been wrong. Lots of theories and speculation about what really happened in Robin Hood Hills have popped up over the years. Everything from a police report from around the time of the boys' disappearances indicating a man covered in blood entered a nearby Bojangles restaurant and was never found, to John Mark Byers' bizarre behavior after his stepson's murder, to DNA from a hair found on the victims linking stepfather Terry Hobbs and his friend David Jacoby to the actual crime scene for which he was eventually questioned. It is clear that this case asks a lot of questions but doesn't provide us with a lot of answers, and has sparked incredible amounts of debate. This is an especially tragic story, not only for Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly, but for the 3 murdered children, Stevie Branch, Christopher Byers, and Michael Moore, who I believe have yet to receive justice. The impact of this case is still felt today, a decade after the West Memphis Three were released from prison, with the recent news that a judge denied advanced DNA testing to allow the trio a chance to clear their names for good. For Damien Echols specifically, his legacy has endured, being the inspiration for a character you might have seen on screen and never even known his connection to, Eddie Munson. Speaking to Deadline, the Duffer Brothers, creators of Stranger Things, had this to say, quote, "When you talk about satanic panic, Damien Echols was not 80s, but we thought he was caught up in something very similar. This mass hysteria. Obviously, Damien is alive now, but this is a tragic story we've been obsessed with. I think we saw the HBO documentary Paradise Lost. We were in high school when we first caught those. And then, of course, we saw West of Memphis. It seemed like a really great character and a means to explore satanic panic. And that's why that character kind of had tragedy etched all over him." End quote. Damien has responded on Twitter to the Duffers, and at the very least, maybe this will breathe new life into the story of the West Memphis Three as a cautionary tale of the satanic panic and what can happen as a result of mass hysteria and the true danger in not accepting what we don't understand.